champion in this event since 2002. 24 years. An entire generation grew up never watching an American stand on that top step. And yet, if you watched closely, the story didn't feel like a desperate chase to end a curse. It felt calm. When Alysa stepped onto the ice, she didn't look hunted. She didn't look tense. She wasn't carrying the face of someone trying to repair history. She looked like someone about to perform something she actually wanted to perform. That detail matters more than it sounds because figure skating at its highest level has never been built on comfort. It has been built on precision, sacrifice, clear throat, fear of error. Millimeters, rotations, edges, judges, panels, staring without blinking. The sport rewards control. That night, she skated to Donna Summer's MacArthur Park suite. Not a tragic concerto, not a weepy violin begging for component scores. Disco confidence, gold fabric catching arena light. It could have backfired, but it didn't. She delivered 7 clean triple jumps. No desperate quad gamble, no reckless last-second risk. Just flow, efficiency, landings with speed, running out of them instead of dying under them. Her final score, 226.79. But numbers weren't the strangest part. The strangest part was the crowd. They weren't reacting like they had witnessed survival. They reacted like they had witnessed permission. That's different. Be honest for a second. Did that program feel like pressure, or did it feel like someone breathing? Because that difference may be the actual headline. For years, the narrative in women's skating hardened into something mechanical. Bigger jumps, younger bodies, push earlier, burn faster, replace sooner. It wasn't official policy, but you could see the pattern. Alysa had once been part of that pattern. At 13, she became the youngest U.S. national champion in history in 2019, and she landed triple axels when most were still learning consistency. She walked into Beijing in 2022 at 16 years old, carrying both expectation and scrutiny. Then she left. No scandal, no dramatic speech, just retirement. A lot of people called it burnout. Some called it wasted potential. Some called it a mistake. What's interesting is what happened next. She lived like someone who wasn't trying to optimize anything. College, friends, travel, music choices that had nothing to do with score sheets, a visual identity that didn't fit the old ice princess mold. And when she came back early 2024, it wasn't framed as redemption. That word never quite fit. It felt more like recalibration. By the time the 2026 games arrived, something about her skating had changed. You could see it in the transitions between elements. Less urgency, more ownership, movements that looked chosen rather than drilled. The old deal in figure skating was simple. The athlete gives everything. Yeah, the system decides what it was worth. That night in Milan, the exchange felt different. She wasn't skating as a product of the machine. She was skating as a collaborator with it. There's a quiet detail that often gets overlooked. After the team event earlier in the games during celebration, her gold medal reportedly broke from its ribbon. Officials offered to replace it. She declined. Some brushed it off as quirky, but gestures matter, especially in tightly managed Olympic environments. Nothing about that week existed in isolation. The federation pressure, the 24-year drought narrative, the constant comparisons to past champions, it was all swirling around her performance, whether she addressed it or not. And yet the tone never felt defensive. That's unusual in Olympic sport. When Sarah Hughes won in 2002, it was shock. When past champions dominated, it was inevitability. With Alysa in 2026, it felt like something else entirely, like the sport itself blinking. And the prevailing interpretation has been simple. She ended the drought, she completed the comeback, she proved the critics wrong, all true. But that reading doesn't explain the atmosphere in the arena. It doesn't explain why commentators kept repeating how relaxed she looked. It doesn't explain why younger skaters watching in mixed zones weren't just applauding, they were studying. Here's the uncomfortable question underneath the gold medal. What if the winning formula just changed? Not the scoring system, not the technical handbook, the formula for what kind of competitor can stand at the top. If she had won through fear and maximum difficulty alone, it would have reinforced the old script. Instead, she won through execution, control, and a visible sense of choice. Choice is not a word historically associated with elite women's skating. And that might be where everything begins to tilt. Because when an athlete proves that joy and structure can coexist at the highest level, it doesn't stay contained to one podium. It spreads quietly. The ice in Milan didn't just crown a champion, it might have answered a question the sport didn't realize it was asking, and that answer has consequences. Before anyone says this was inevitable, pause. It wasn't. If you rewind 10 years, even 5, the idea that a returning skater openly retired at 16 would come back and win Olympic gold without chasing the most extreme technical layout. That would have sounded naive. Figure skating, especially on the women's side, evolved into something brutally simple. Rotate more, rotate earlier, rotate younger. Quadruple jumps became the currency. Risk became reputation. The environment didn't officially demand suffering, but it rewarded it. That period wasn't chaotic by accident. Federations were chasing global dominance. Scores inflated. Technical base values escalated. Commentators started talking about weapons instead of programs. Young prodigies were fast-tracked. Bodies peaked at 17 and disappeared by 19. Nothing about that system was illegal, but it wasn't neutral either. When Alysa Liu burst onto the national stage in 2019, 13 years old, triple axels, youngest US champion ever, she fit the blueprint perfectly. She was hailed as the future, a technical answer to international powerhouses. The machine loved prodigies. And to be fair, prodigies loved competing. But prodigies age. By Beijing 2022, she finished 6th. Respectable, strong. But if you watched her interviews closely, there was a stillness there. Not anger, not disappointment, something quieter. Weeks later, she retired. The dominant reading at the time was predictable. Burnout, too much pressure, wasted momentum. That explanation solved part of the equation. It didn't solve the whole thing. Because stepping away at 16 in elite sport is an act of defiance, whether framed that way or not. Federations don't design systems around pauses. These sponsors don't celebrate sabbaticals. Television contracts don't build around uncertainty. And yet, she left. Here's where it gets more interesting. She didn't return with a vengeance narrative. She didn't return promising quads or dominance. She returned with something less dramatic but far more destabilizing. Control. That word doesn't show up in headlines often, it's not flashy. But in high-performance systems, control over training structure, choreography, music, pacing, that's power. Old skating culture rarely centered the athlete's voice in those decisions. Programs were built to please judging trends. Costumes were optimized for aesthetic expectation. Emotional expression was sculpted to maximize component scores. Execution came first. Identity followed. Alysa inverted that order, not loudly, not with speeches, quietly. Her 2024 comeback season wasn't a demolition tour. It was measured, layouts adjusted, emphasis on clean execution rather than maximum base value, fewer reckless attempts at bone-crushing quads, more emphasis on edge quality, transitions, program cohesion. Some critics questioned it. Is that enough internationally? A fair question. At that time, the women's field was stacked with skaters chasing technical ceilings. The safer path would have been to join that escalation. She didn't, and here's the uncomfortable truth. That restraint might have been the innovation, because what the system conditioned everyone to believe was that difficulty equals dominance. Full stop. But skating has two sides: technical score and program components, numbers and interpretation, mechanics and presence. Somewhere along the way, the second half began to feel ornamental. In Milan, it didn't. Her free skate wasn't built like a survival test. It was built like a performance designed to last 4 minutes without cracking. Each triple carried speed out of the landing. Each spin centered cleanly. No desperation in the step sequences, no visible panic. It's easy to mistake composure for simplicity. It isn't. Composure under Olympic lighting is architectural. It requires conditioning, yes, but it also requires autonomy. When athletes feel owned by the moment rather than trapped inside it, the difference shows in tiny transitions. The half second after a landing, the shoulder position entering a spin. Details that judges feel even when viewers don't consciously register them. And here's something rarely said out loud. Federations watch other federations. When a layout that prioritizes execution quality beats programs stacked with high-risk instability. Conversations shift behind closed doors. Coaching strategies adapt. Talent pipelines adjust. Not overnight, but gradually. The interpretation many offered after her gold was clean and comforting. She overcame adversity. That's one version. Another version is this. She demonstrated that the dominant technical arms race might not be the only viable path forward. That's disruptive because if clean, confident triples with high grades of execution can outscore risky chaos, the incentive structure recalibrates. And if athletes observe that stepping away didn't destroy her trajectory, that autonomy didn't ruin competitiveness, the psychological grip of the old deal loosens. Notice something else about that week in Italy. Media coverage didn't frame her as a martyr to discipline. They framed her as grounded, calm, even joyful. That word again, joy, is destabilizing in systems built on fear of mistakes. This isn't sentimental commentary, it's structural. Elite women's skating has long operated on an unspoken exchange. Give the sport everything early, and maybe it will give you medals before your window closes. Alysa interrupted that timeline. She left. She returned older. She won. That sequence doesn't just change headlines. It stretches the acceptable arc of a career. And when career arcs stretch, development models must stretch with them. The old deal said urgency. Her trajectory suggested longevity. Those aren't small differences. They alter how young athletes imagine their future in the sport. They alter how coaches pace technical escalation. They alter how federations calculate investment timelines. One podium can't transform a system alone, but it can expose alternatives. And once alternatives are visible, they're hard to erase. What happened in Milan wasn't just about a 24-year drought ending. It may have been about the beginning of a different contract altogether. And contracts, even unspoken ones, can be rewritten quietly, sometimes without the sport realizing it happened. There's a moment in every sport when the audience realizes they're watching more than a result. It's not loud, it doesn't announce itself, it's a sensation. While during Alysa Liu's free skate in Milan, that sensation settled in about halfway through the program. Not after the last jump, not at the final pose. Halfway. She had just landed another clean triple flowing exit. No check, no skid. The step sequence began, and instead of bracing for the next element, she leaned into it, shoulder open, head lifted, eyes engaged with the crowd. That's when it registered. She wasn't surviving the Olympics, she was using it. That distinction matters. For years, elite skating, especially under Olympic pressure, looked like containment. Athletes holding tension in their necks, jaws clenched between elements, eyes fixed down ice like they were diffusing a device. Perfection wasn't optional, it was oxygen. But Milan felt different. And what's interesting is that this shift didn't begin in that arena. It had been forming for 2 seasons. When she returned in 2024, observers noticed something subtle. And her programs weren't structured around peak difficulty moments anymore. They were structured around continuity. The layout breathed. Instead of cramming the highest base value jumps early to secure points, there was pacing. Risk distributed strategically, recovery margin built in. That kind of program design isn't passive, it's deliberate. Behind the scenes, this was the part no one glamorized. Rebuilding stamina, recalibrating jump timing, negotiating training intensity with self-rust instead of fear. Nothing in that process screams headline, but it builds sustainability. And sustainability is not a word the women's field historically celebrated. Here's where things get layered. Figure skating isn't judged in isolation. Trends ripple across seasons. What earns high grades of execution one year recalibrates expectations the next. Component scores reflect not only technical precision, but presence, musical interpretation, your skating skills, transitions. For years, commentators talked about backloading risk and technical content ceilings. But when a program wins Olympic gold without maximizing theoretical difficulty, when it maximizes cleanliness and cohesion, you can almost hear coaching rooms recalculating. Not publicly, internally. Because federations don't just care who wins, they care how. If the scoring spread rewards composure over chaos, the cost-benefit analysis shifts. Training cycles adjust. Younger skaters aren't rushed as aggressively toward Ultra-C elements before their bodies can absorb the stress. That doesn't mean quads disappear. It means they're no longer the only currency, and that's a structural shift. In Milan, her free skate score, 152, wasn't astronomical by arms race standards, but it was efficient. The total 226.79 created separation without spectacle. It was technical discipline fused with emotional clarity. Onto the dominant reading afterward focused on the drought ending. That's understandable. 24 years is a clean storyline. But the cleaner storyline often hides the more interesting one, because what Milan suggested wasn't that the US finally found another prodigy to push through the system. It suggested the system might bend around a different profile of athlete. Someone older, more self-directed, less dependent on institutional urgency. That's uncomfortable for rigid structures. And yet, nothing about that week felt rebellious in tone. She didn't criticize the sport. She didn't denounce its past. She competed inside its rules. She just didn't internalize its anxieties. There's a difference between confrontation and indifference. Confrontation sparks headlines. Indifference shifts culture. She didn't appear threatened by comparison to the reigning world champions from Japan or South Korea. She didn't skate like someone defending a narrative. She skated like someone evaluating her own performance against her own standard. That posture, especially at the Olympics, changes how pressure manifests. Pressure still existed. It always does. But it didn't own her. When athletes younger than her, 17, 16, watch that. They don't just see technique. They see time. They see that a career doesn't have to peak at the earliest possible moment. Longevity becomes imaginable. And once longevity becomes imaginable, urgency loses some of its grip. Now here's another layer people don't talk about much. Media tone. The coverage around her didn't frame the win as redemption. It wasn't, she returned to avenge Beijing. It was, she skated freely. Words matter. Narratives become templates. Sponsors respond to that tone. Broadcasters echo it. Coaches absorb it. Nothing about this unfolds in a vacuum, even the aesthetic choice. Disco, Donna Summer. Gold dress catching arena light instead of a somber, classical piece nudged perception. It suggested that modern skating can intersect with broader culture without sacrificing competitive legitimacy. That's subtle but significant. The sport has always lived inside tradition. Tradition isn't inherently restrictive, but when tradition calcifies, audiences drift. In Milan, something reconnected. Viewers who hadn't followed quad difficulty charts suddenly felt something tangible again. They weren't calculating base value. They were responding to flow. That kind of response widens the sport's appeal. And expanded appeal influences funding, youth enrollment, broadcast investment. It's all connected even when it's not visible. The prevailing narrative still says she won because she executed. That's true, but she also altered the emotional temperature of the event. And emotional temperature influences decision M more than statistics do. What Milan revealed wasn't rebellion. It was range. Range in how a champion can look, move, compete, age. Once that range exists in front of judges, federations, and young athletes watching at home, it doesn't disappear easily. The sport won't announce a philosophical pivot. It never does. But shifts like this echo in training rinks months later, in conversations about pacing, in the subtle permission granted to athletes who don't fit the old urgency timeline. And that's where transformation actually happens. Not in speeches and patterns changing quietly, and the night felt different because it was different. The question now isn't whether Alysa changed, it's whether the sport will follow. By the time the medal ceremony ended in Milan, the obvious part was done. Flag raised, anthem played, cameras flashing. But that's not where the real tension sits. The real tension begins the morning after, because once an Olympic result exposes a different way to win, the sport has to decide whether that result was an exception or a signal. For 2 decades, the women's field operated under acceleration. Younger champions, higher risk, shorter windows. The margin for error narrowed. The margin for longevity shrank. Alysa didn't just win, she widened the margin. And margins change behavior. If you're a coach watching from another federation, you don't just replay the jumps, you replay the structure. Why did her program hold up under pressure? Why didn't it unravel late? Why did the components climb instead of plateau? You notice the absence of desperation? Desperation leaves traces, tight landings, forced expressions. Recovery scrambles between elements. Milan didn't have that, and here's where it gets complicated. When a system runs for years on urgency, it builds incentives around urgency. Early specialization, rapid difficulty escalation, compressing development timelines. If a 20-year-old wins gold after stepping away and recalibrating her relationship with the sport, that story doesn't fit neatly into the old incentive structure. It introduces flexibility. Flexibility disrupts predictability, and predictability is comfortable for institutions. The dominant reading says this was a triumphant comeback. That interpretation solves the emotional narrative. It doesn't address the structural implications, because if autonomy becomes competitive leverage, not weakness, then athlete-driven decisions gain legitimacy. Music selection, training load adjustments, and strategic layout choices that protect longevity instead of chasing theoretical maximum base value. None of those ideas are radical alone. Together, they shift culture. There's also the generational layer. Athletes entering senior ranks today grew up in a different world than the ones who dominated the 2000s. They grew up with open conversations about mental health, with visible examples of athletes in other sports setting boundaries with social media amplifying personality as much as podiums. And Milan didn't create that environment. It reflected it. That timing wasn't accidental. Nothing in elite sport exists in isolation from its era. In 2002, when the last American woman won Olympic gold before this, the sports ecosystem looked different. Social media didn't exist. Athlete voice was filtered. Career arcs were shorter, narratives simpler. By 2026, the audience expects transparency. They expect personality. They expect to understand not just how an athlete wins, but who they are while winning. Alysa's trajectory aligned with that expectation. Not through activism, not through manifesto, through posture, through visible ownership of her program, through competing like someone who chose to be there. That image travels. It influences young skaters more than federation memos ever will. And here's the subtle risk the sport now faces. If the field responds by overcorrecting, by branding joy while still accelerating bodies beyond sustainable limits, the shift collapses into marketing. The difference between cultural change and aesthetic change is depth. Milan hinted at depth, but depth requires follow-through. If federations extend development windows, if coaches balance technical ambition with long-term pacing, if athletes feel permission to leave and return without being erased from relevance, then we're looking at transformation. If not, then Milan becomes a beautiful anomaly. The old guard may argue that one Olympic result doesn't rewrite competitive logic. That's fair, but competitive logic isn't static. It adapts to what wins. And what won in 2026 wasn't maximal risk. It was precision plus composure. It was strategy without panic. It was difficulty integrated, not stacked. That formula is replicable, not easy, but replicable. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. If athletes begin aiming for sustainability instead of speed, who loses influence? Short-term medal strategies lose urgency. Development systems built on early peaking lose leverage. Narratives that equate suffering with legitimacy lose their grip. None of that happens overnight. But once an alternative model produces gold on the sport's biggest stage, the alternative can't be dismissed as naive. It becomes data. And data changes conversations quietly at first. Then in training plans, then in selection criteria, then in how commentators describe excellence. You may not see the shift in the next season, but listen carefully in press conferences. Watch how layouts are constructed. Notice which risks are taken and which are deliberately left out. The most interesting part of this story isn't what Alysa achieved. It's what others decide to do because she achieved it that way. So here's the open question. 5 years from now, will we look back at Milan as the end of a drought or the start of a recalibration? Did the sport simply crown a champion, or did it glimpse a version of itself that feels more durable? You've watched the evolution. You've seen the eras come and go. When you saw her skate that night, be honest. Did it feel like pressure, or did it feel like possibility? Because if it felt like possibility, then this may have changed more than a medal.